Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Is the world in danger of overreacting to worst case epidemiological surveys? And was in fact a 3-week nationwide total lockdown the right response from the Indian point of view? Those are two key issues that I shall raise today with the Dean of the School of Graduate Studies at ICRA University and a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He is, of course, today speaking to us in his personal capacity. His name is Ananth Nageshwaran. Dr. Nageshwaran, let's start with the epidemiological surveys based upon which governments the world over are deciding how to fight COVID-19. Now, the problem is these surveys vary enormously. For instance, in the Indian case, scholars of Johns Hopkins University and the Center for Disease Dynamics in Washington have estimated that by July, India could have between 300 million and 500 million infections. On the other hand, the Armed Forces Medical College says that by the end of May, India will only have 3 million infections. And there's a huge range there. And commenting on this, you wrote in the paper Mint on Thursday that there is a real incentivization to exaggerate on the part of epidemiologists. So how should we respond to these surveys?
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for having me on the show and also for clarifying that I'm speaking in my personal capacity here. I wrote this column for Mint last Tuesday, and of course, I actually cited the late Hans Rosling, who said both epidemiologists and long jumpers have a tendency to exaggerate their figures. So it was not my quote, it was actually Hans Rosling's message. And you are right to point out the couple of studies that talk about a few hundred millions of infections in India. And I basically focused on the debate that is probably still going on between the Imperial College and the Oxford University study, etc. So although there is a wide range of estimates and studies and lots of information gaps still exist, the public discourse both from the experts and from the media and other commentators has been that all governments have to basically go for the worst case scenario. So the pressure is more coming from the experts who are failing to acknowledge what they don't know. And what they know is only a very small portion of the pie. And that is the problem that has also put a lot of pressure on many governments to go in one particular direction. And that is what I was referring to. So when I said we in that article, I was referring to the expert opinion that is pushing the public opinion and government action in one single direction without taking cognizance or without taking into consideration all possible range of outcomes and scenarios.
I want to pick up on that point because, in fact, in your article in Mint, you made this very clear. I'm quoting you. You said, we delude ourselves into thinking that we can model the virus and come out with, as a result, apocalyptic predictions while dismissing others who have another point of view. Decisions, you say, are being guided by the belief there is only one set of answers. And the point you're making there is that everyone is going on the basis of the worst case scenario. We're ignoring the better case scenarios, and we have no rational reason for preferring one over the other.
When I say we, I again want to reiterate that I was referring to the experts. And when I say decisions are being guided, the guidance is coming from epidemiologists and research institutions right from February onwards, which have been talking about hundreds of millions of infections, not just in India, but everywhere in the world. And if you look at, for example, the case of Brazil, where the government initially and until recently tried to sort of have a different approach, there is tremendous pressure from the civil society in that country and from within the cabinet that is forcing the government to go in one single direction. And take the case of Sweden, which also is still experimenting with a different approach, but there too, there is dire warnings are being issued that Sweden is pursuing a dangerous path. So even from the point of view of having multiple experiments and multiple approaches, which actually should be welcomed by us, because that will give us different outcomes to evaluate, that is not being allowed. And here, therefore, I would once again point to the fact that expert opinion is acting more as a fundamentalist force here, pushing public opinion and government action in a single direction.
So what you're saying is that experts basically epidemiologists, are all going by their worst case surveys. That is creating pressure for the media, which hypes it up and sensationalizes it. That puts the public into a frenzy. And as a result, governments also end up ignoring better case scenarios and act only in accordance with the worst possible outcome.
Well, I wouldn't say governments are ignoring. Governments are left with no choice but to respond in a particular manner, because that is the intensity of this expert opinion coming from one particular point of view, and also the intensity of 24/7 presence of media today, and also the social media, etc., which actually gives no room at all for an alternative discourse in this particular case. And that is what I was referring to. And I mean, you could see that in multiple situations, not just with this pandemic, but also in economic scenarios which happened. Yeah.
But let's take up that point you're making, that governments have no choice but to go with the worst case scenario because of the pressure from the media, from public opinion, and also from epidemiologists themselves.
Yeah.
But let me put an opposite view to you. This is clearly a crisis. Why in a crisis is acting in terms of the worst case not the best course? At least then you're catering for the worst thing that can happen.
No, see, I cannot sit in judgment of the government's decision, and I am not. So yes, you are right. Making the decision on the basis of the worst case scenario, even if the probability of the worst case scenario is relatively low, is supposed to be the most prudent risk management approach. That is why I will not fault the government in any country for falling in line with this point of view. Where I am faulting is, once again, and that is what the article was trying to stress, is are governments and decision makers being presented with all points of view, or is there a forced convergence towards one single scenario? That we don't know, and that is a hypothetical question. If they were indeed presented with the true cost-benefit analysis, would they have decided differently? And that I cannot answer. That's a counterfactual scenario which unfortunately doesn't exist.
Except that there is a very interesting sentence in your Mint article that I want to quote to you. Mm-hmm. After pointing out that the media is amplifying and sensationalizing the worst case epidemiological surveys, after pointing out that this has whipped the public into a frenzy, you then write, and I'm quoting, what is the result? Economic shutdowns that could eventually kill and destroy more people and livelihoods than would be saved by those very same lockdowns. That's the problem, isn't it? That we are entering into a sort of lockdown, the cost of which may actually endanger more people than it actually saves.
That could be possible, and that's exactly the kind of service that experts should be doing, presenting the true costs and benefits of either approach, because one is immediate, another one is insidious and happens over a longer period of time. And that kind of information and on an honest two-handed approach to the problem hasn't been made available to almost all governments around the world, and that is the issue. You are right. So, and also the debate has been framed in a wrong way by most commentators as one of lives versus livelihoods, and that is not the right way to frame the issue, and that is in fact is set up to push governments towards one particular path of action.
In fact, I'm going to put it bluntly, but there is a real danger or risk that if we keep going by the worst case epidemiological surveys, we may end up taking such action that in many real ways the cure becomes worse than the disease. People could lose jobs in hundreds of thousands, if not millions. As a result, they could be hungry. Many who are poor and vulnerable will die, and you could end up where the cure seems worse than the disease.
No, I mean, this is the situation that governments across the world face. I mean, regardless of whether it is a developing or developed country, whether the cure becomes worse than the problem is exactly the formulation that President Trump actually used in one of his press conferences, and he was excoriated for saying so. That's again comes back to the point that we have been talking in the last few minutes. Are we, when I say are we the elites and the experts permitting alternative points of view to be aired and considered and pros and cons analyzed? And that is the crux of the issue.
There's no doubt that a heavy responsibility lies with what you call elites and experts, the media, and even in a sense public opinion, because they may not be allowing the government to consider alternate opinions. Mm-hmm. But there is also a responsibility on the government. At the end of the day, the government has to be aware that there are alternatives, and it must bear them in mind before it goes entirely down one road. Because the government knows that if it goes entirely down one road, the worst case scenario route, then there is a cost that is being paid, and that cost could be dreadful. So surely governments also have to take this on board.
No, governments, in fact, they don't think that they're acting irresponsibly. They are thinking that because the way the debate has been framed, and in these matters, because it is a technical issue, it is a subject matter issue, and clearly the burden on the experts is much higher than it is in a normal decision-making situation. And that is why the burden is relatively greater. And the governments around the world are thinking that they are indeed acting very responsibly by putting the economy behind saving lives. Yes, governments have a responsibility and they are acting with responsibility, and that is what they would say. So, I mean, we can't have it both ways. We can't accuse them of acting irresponsibly by ignoring alternative points of view while we are just peddling one particular point of view. I don't think there is a consistency here.
But in fact, what we are also doing is saying to the government, please look at the alternative points of view, please bear them in mind, please consider them carefully before you decide to jettison them.
That has been few and far between, if at all. That has, in fact, only in many countries, even now, that kind of point of view has been somewhat rarer to find, whereas you look at the way headlines and breaking news and emails that pop into your mailbox is all about the number of deaths per day happening in Italy or New York or Spain, without putting those numbers in the context of the overall infections that happen in a typical flu season, the number of deaths that happen in a typical year due to other causes, etc. All those contexts and nuances are missing.
Now, in fact, with this in mind, you make one more very important point in your article for the Mint. You say one other consequence of how governments are acting is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which you say has gripped public intellectuals. What exactly is the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Well, again, Dunning-Kruger effect is very, very readily applicable to experts who always end up overestimating their abilities to analyze, assess, and predict events, and also simultaneously underestimate the abilities of others. And that is what is the Dunning-Kruger effect. So it applies much more to intellectuals and experts rather than to decision makers.
So in fact, what you're saying is that experts at the moment are overestimating their capacity to understand and underestimating the capacity of people who disagree with them, which will in fact reinforce, if I can use that word, their prejudice or their line of thinking.
Which is also a replay of the Dunning-Kruger effect all over again.
Absolutely. And this is one further reason why it's very important that before experts advise follow the worst case route, or before governments decide to only act in line with the worst case route, they should pause, sit down and say to themselves, what are the alternatives? How good are the alternatives? What are the costs? And then decide.
Again, I would put the onus more on the expert opinion that comes their way, because they somehow conclude, and that's exactly what I alluded to with the Dunning-Kruger effect analogy here, that providing the decision makers with too many options and scenarios will be too complicated for them to process. So I'll just present one single point of view. This is the decision that experts make, and that's exactly the play of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and that is the real issue.
I take your point that in a moment of crisis, governments are very dependent upon the expert opinion they get, and therefore the onus is on experts to make sure that the opinion they give is balanced, that alternative views are being given as much airtime or airplay so that governments can then decide. But can I add this?
Please.
Governments have the right to reject expert opinion. Frequently, they do. When politicians decide they don't want to follow expert opinion, they feel no compulsion. So there is still a responsibility on politicians to say to themselves, I want more opinion. I want to see the alternative. I know there are different surveys. Tell me more about the different ones. There is an onus on them. Maybe it's not as much, but that onus hasn't gone.
Yeah, no, I hear you, but in this particular instance, when you have governments all around the world, I mean, politicians may be rejecting or accepting experts' advice in different matters, depending on the situation, whether it is unique to their country or in a different context. But in this particular context, when developed countries across the world are going in one particular direction, let me bring you another analogy here. In the world of investing, where I have spent more than 2 decades, there are research groups and there are decision makers who pull the trigger on where to put the money. And there are two kinds of risks that a decision maker in an investing situation faces. One is called the consensus risk, and the second one is called the conviction risk. If I go with the consensus as an investor, allocating money to whichever market, whichever asset class, then if the consensus is right, I'm right. If the consensus is wrong, then I'm wrong, and I'm not the only one who's wrong. Conviction risk is much more volatile. You can be spectacular success, you can be a spectacular failure. And most investment managers who consider themselves highly educated and experienced will always tend to choose the consensus risk in an area where they are actually experts themselves. So now compare the situation with the governments and politicians who are not experts in epidemiology or pandemics or infections. So they would be having a much higher incentive and tendency to go with the consensus, especially if almost the entire developed world is going in one particular direction. So I'm not entirely sure that I would agree with your putting the onus on the decision makers in this particular situation.
In which case, the conclusion we come to as we end part one is that if nearly all the governments in the world are responding in terms of the worst case scenario, that will only make it yet more difficult for a government to be an outlier. And that means that if everyone's responding in terms of the worst case scenario, then the cost in terms of what you're doing to the economy could be very, very large. And there's a real danger that if the worst case scenario turns out to be wrong, right, and one of the better cases is correct, you'll have crippled the economy to save a much fewer number of lives. And at the end of it all, we may say to ourselves, oh dear, we overreacted and we've cost ourselves our livelihoods and our future.
Yeah, but that is the benefit of hindsight that most of us would have. But decisions are being made in real time. So yeah, that is the risk. Any decision situation any decision maker takes that risk. You could be right or you could be wrong. Yes, in this particular situation, the cost of being wrong on either direction or being positioned as extremely enormous, and they have gone with one particular direction because that is where the preponderance of opinion led them to, so-called expert opinion. And of course, the costs are going to be enormous either way. So there is no easy choice here for them. Therefore, having gone in one particular path, the only thing now we can sort of look forward to is the mitigating steps.
Dr. Nageshwaran, let's focus on India. In that article that you wrote for Mint on the 30th of March, you said, it's too soon to tell if the lockdown was the right decision. 1 week later, do you have a clearer idea, or is the jury still out?
No, I think in these situations, the jury is still out. It will be still difficult to say it was a right or it was a wrong call. So I think, as we discussed a few minutes ago, the decision is something that all governments around the world have pursued. And in fact, until several years later, when all the information about the virus and its at the current gaps that exist are known to us, it will be difficult to evaluate it in real time.
So at the moment, the jury is still out. Is that right?
Very much so.
Let me put it like this. If one goes by the Armed Forces Medical College survey, and it turns out to be correct, something like 13,500 Indians would have sadly died by the end of May. On the other hand, we know that already tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of daily wage workers, people employed, now unemployed by the unorganized sector, and rural agricultural labor have lost their jobs, and are suffering not just terrible hardship, but actual hunger. And some of them we know will die. Is this a disproportionate cost to pay for saving 13,500 lives from coronavirus? Or is that a morally incorrect question?
No, you are actually making the same mistake that we discussed earlier, that you are now positing this as almost the only definitive scenario. That is the problem. I mean, this is one of the many scenarios that are being presented, but you also mentioned in your initial remarks there are several studies that talk about hundreds of millions of people getting infected by July, etc. So, if you put that in the context, then the decision to impose a 21-day lockdown, going by that model, was justified. So I think the problem once again is in the framing.
In other words, you're also saying that the answer to the question I posed will only be known when the epidemic is over,
Yeah.
and we know how many lives were killed versus what damage was done to the economy and to livelihoods. We
And
don't know then.
And that would, of course, once again, just to remind you and the viewers, that would be with the benefit of hindsight.
Absolutely. In which case, let me ask you this. If you had been consulted, would you have advised a total 3-week nationwide lockdown, or would you have suggested something more calibrated, more staggered, less sweeping?
No, that's a very, very hypothetical question, which I can't answer because, again, I'm an economist. I'm not even an economist by training, but most by practice. And you have the weight of epidemiologist evidence on the one hand. So all I would say once again is the presentation of all the information, the decision making has to be done by those who have the costs and benefits into consideration. So that's a very hypothetical question to answer.
Now, the lockdown, as you know, ends on the 14th, which is roughly 8 days away.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it should be extended? I know you can only go by your hunch, but what's your hunch?
So I think that there are conversations. Even today, this morning, I saw in the newspapers, in the Financial Times, that Europe, which is one of the epicenters of the pandemic, is considering a staggered lockdown, and in fact, even as Europe is talking about a staggered relaxation, Singapore is going into starting from tomorrow, even into an extended or slightly more intense lockdown. So I think from the Indian standpoint, given that the trajectory of death since the first death was reported on March 12 has been much lower than what other countries have experienced, there is a case for a more targeted approach towards the lockdowns rather than maintaining the nationwide lockdown.
So, given the trajectory of deaths in India, there is a good case for a more targeted lockdown, more specific to certain areas or certain professions rather than nationwide and total.
I think at the moment, as we speak, and we still have a week to go, there will be more information because the information in this situation is changing on an exponential basis every day. And some of the people I am in touch with who are also public health experts are coming around to the view that yes, Indian fatalities are rising at a rate which is markedly different and lower than what we have seen in the Western nations. So in that sense, yes.
In that sense, therefore, there is a case for a targeted,
That's
graded, calibrated lockdown.
we can slowly stagger the lockdown. We can relax it, and we can sort of experiment. So this is going to be a trial and error situation for some more time, and we should be able to relax it in certain areas, both geographically and also sectorally.
Meanwhile, how do you assess the package of measures announced by the finance minister? They added up to a total of 1.70 lakh crore, which is 0.8% of GDP. Now, many people said that in fact it should have been considerably higher. Some people have said it should have been something like 5-6%, others have said 10. I believe not just the Americas and the Britons, but even Malaysia, a country around the corner from where you are, has done much more. Should she have been more generous?
See, first of all, we should understand that contrary to the conventional wisdom in the West, where they have been advocating fiscal prudence for decades, to us now they are actually tidying up a lot of spending, which doesn't necessarily count as on budget expenditure. So if you look at even Malaysia, you mentioned, in fact, only 20% of their announced package is on budget, 80% is off budget. And if India also actually had included all the moratoriums and the compliance relaxations which she announced a couple of days earlier, and also take into consideration what the Reserve Bank of India has done in terms of announcing moratoriums on various payments, etc., then it would amount to a fairly sizable package. So I would say in this situation that is evolving rapidly, crossing the river by feeling the stones is a pretty good approach too.
So you're saying two things. Number one, actually, if you bear in mind the full package in terms of moratoriums, loan deferments, liquidity excess that has been done, India matches up very well to countries like Malaysia. It's only that Malaysia looks better because so many things are off budget.
Not just Malaysia, if you look at, Britain, which was one of the first ones to come out, quote unquote, with all guns blazing, the numbers were touted as 15 to 17% of GDP. But if you look at the Fitch ratings, which downgraded the UK's credit rating, they show that for 2020, the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio in the UK will raise from 2.1% to 9.1% of GDP. So on budget, it is 7%, which is even 60% lower than what was projected as the full package. And that is what we need to focus on. And I think it's all right for us to sort of do it in a gradual way, announce something, see what the reaction is, where the gaps are, and then top it up. So you have had 3 rounds of announcements. One is lots of compliance relaxations, and then targeting the most needy segments of the population, and then Reserve Bank of India providing aggregate liquidities and forbearance, etc. So there is been a steady stream of announcements, and that probably is as good as any other approach.
Let me ask you about 3 specific sectors one by one. To begin with, do you think the finance minister has done enough to help daily wage workers, people in the unorganized sector who become unemployed, and rural landless labor? As far as I can tell, there are only 2 measures that cater for them. Firstly, the increase in NREGA rates, but who knows whether NREGA work is happening during the lockdown. And secondly, if this category of people have wives with Jan Dhan accounts, in which case they'll get 500 rupees per month. But beyond that, I can't see anything else. Hence my question, has she done enough?
No, I think in terms of food availability, in terms of suspension of payments, and also in terms of higher contribution to self-help groups and Jan Dhan account holders and NREGA. So yes, ultimately it is a question of empirical evidence for us to answer whether this is enough or something more needs to be done. I think on the face of it, all the measures that were announced clearly had defined beneficiaries. Therefore, the question of leakage was already taken into consideration, and quite a wide segment of the population was sought to be addressed. Now, whether it does or doesn't is a matter of feedback from the ground, and which you need to incorporate into your subsequent measures.
So in other words, as soon as you discover that you haven't done enough, you need to act immediately to do more.
I think that is what we have seen happening either with the IBC or with the GST. There has been a constant willingness to respond to feedback and empirical experiences, and I think that is the way to go here, because it is, you look at many countries, lots of situations they are actually discovering after the fact, and it is not just true of India, it is true of even advanced countries.
Or can I point out a difference, Dr. Nageshwar? We're talking about hundreds of millions of very, very poor, vulnerable people.
I agree.
The people who pay GST or the people who fall under IBC were not either vulnerable or poor in the same way. These are desperately poor people whose capacity to survive for 2-3 days without income is null. I think it literally is nil. Therefore, should we not have acted generously to begin with, rather than be niggardly and say, but I'll make up for it later on?
No, what is niggardly? And first of all, let me just point out to you that the example I brought out with respect to IBC and GST is about to point out the responsiveness for the feedback that emerges from on the ground experience. So I understand very well that we're talking about different categories of people, and this category requires urgent attention, and that is why the very first package that the government came out with was meant for the poor and the needy and the extremely low income households. So clearly the government also in fact accepts your prioritization.
So you don't agree with the opinion that the government has not done anywhere enough for these people?
I mean, at the end of, I think I see this more as an opinion, and I think, as I said, the answer would be more. It is policy wise, it is productive and purposeful to discuss it on the basis of evidence. And also, we are forgetting that many state governments also on their own have announced a lot of measures. And typically, if you look at the percentages of GDP that we are aggregating around the world and saying governments have done enough, we should also be adding what all the state governments themselves have announced for their for people in their states. So that is why I am not willing to accept purely on the basis of a statement that government hasn't done enough for the needy segments of the population.
Let's come then to a second sector of the economy, often referred to by the pink papers as India Inc. The finance minister and the RBI have announced loan deferments, they've reduced the repo rate, and they've also increased liquidity by a fairly substantial 3.7 lakh. Do we need a specific stimulus for industry?
So again, when you talk of industry, I'm not just talking of India Inc. You can actually include businesses of all sizes, and just as households do not necessarily have liquidity or cash to pay for, let's say, 3 or 6 months of expenses, companies also depend on income flows to be able to meet their payments, and bulk of it is rather labor cost. And therefore, regardless of the size of the business, we do need a facility that enables them to keep their businesses going without having to let go of workers by continuing to pay them salaries, etc. And that had to be the first line of support for the. Of course, they have already paid their March salaries, etc. So there is still a bit of time before we come to the crunch situation towards the latter half of the month. So that is the one immediate and important facility to consider.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying there is a need for a stimulus to industry, particularly to encourage them to keep their staff and not to lay them off, something like what Britain has done. But the moment is not necessarily now. You can even do it by the middle of the month or the end of the month.
First of all, I would like to clarify that the word stimulus is wrong. I call it more of fiscal support. Stimulus comes later once the lockdown is over and the virus, the pandemic has kind of peaked, the infection rates, etc., etc. Then you talk about stimulating the economy. Right now, it is to keep the show going. I think we do have a small window of time wherein we can evaluate the various options and the pros and cons and the side effects, etc. Then announce a support which lets businesses of almost all sizes to be able to retain their workforce.
Finally, what about the Rabi harvest? This is precisely when the Rabi crop should be harvested. It's said to be a bumper crop this year, but as you know, there is a crippling shortage of agricultural labor, if agricultural labor is around to begin with. And secondly, most mandis, not just primary mandis, but secondary mandis are paralyzed. And again, without agricultural labor, mandis can't function. So what's your advice to central and state governments? Because the period for harvesting is a very limited period. If it's not done, then the crop is lost.
No, I mean, I'm not an agricultural sector expert, and this is a good question. And this is an important question because you have not only the need for labor to harvest the current crop, but also for sowing for the next crop as well. And to a limited extent, I've been asking various contacts at in different states, and the feedback I am getting is relatively mixed in the sense that in some states, in some parts of the country, I heard that there isn't an issue of availability of labor, and in some parts I heard it as yes. Therefore, it becomes an important area for local governments and state governments to address here to make sure that while taking into consideration the health implications, to make sure that labor availability for both the harvesting and the sowing operations is ensured.
So you're saying, if I understand correctly, that you need a different response for different regions. In some regions, labor is missing. In others, it's not. So for different regions, you need a different response.
I think that is the impression I am getting, and that's the feedback I am getting from the ground based on my limited anecdotal information gathering in the last 2-3 days.
Finally, my last question, Dr. Nageshwaran, what sort of growth do you expect, GDP growth, for the year that's just ended? If you notice, Fitch and Moody's have actually downscaled India's growth to 2 and 2.5% respectively. Nomura has actually said that in fact the Indian economy will shrink in the year that's ended by something like 0.5%. What's your expectation?
Oh, Indian economy will shrink in the year that just ended in March 2020? No.
That's what Nomura said. That's what Nomura said.
Oh, I mean, they probably would have meant that the quarter between January and March 2020. They would have probably mentioned, but for the year as a whole, from April 2019 to March 2020, Indian economy would still record a decent positive growth rate. And for the year ending March 2021, estimates are still being made, and right now, no estimate is even remotely scientific or methodical. It is just a pie in the sky exercise, and that is what I see across the world as well.
In fact, I'm not going to ask you about the next year, and I deliberately wasn't going to raise it because that depends so much on how bad COVID-19 is. It depends so much on what economic cost we've paid to handle it that we simply can't forecast what growth ending March 2021 will be. But do you think Fitch and Moody's could be right about growth that just ended on the 31st of March 2020? Because they say for the year as a whole, it'll be just 2 or 2.5%.
For the year as a whole, no, I think there is some confusion here. If I understand correctly, Fitch and Moody's are predicting 2.5% real GDP growth for the year 20 to 21, April 20 to March 21. For the year that ended in March 2020, I think the growth rates are still relatively closer to between 4 and 5% rather than 2.5%. I think probably there is some confusion there.
I'm simply relying on what pink papers like the Business Standard and the Economic Times reported, and I double-checked with them, and they clearly said for the year ending March 2020, this is the figures from Moody's, which I hope you're right. I hope you're right. That is at least one element of reassuring news.
That strikes me as very, very low, and I don't think we will achieve such a low number. I expect that the number for the year ending March 2020 would be higher, whereas an estimate of somewhere between 2 and 3% with the risks towards either upside or downside symmetrically distributed is more likely for the year ending March 21, the year we just began.
Yeah. So what is your estimate? And I know I'm asking you to stick your neck out. What's your estimate for the year that's just ended?
For the current fiscal year that just started?
The one that's just ended March 30th, 2020.
I still think, as I mentioned to you earlier, I still think that the growth numbers would be somewhere between 4 and 5% for the whole year rather than between 2 and 3% as you are pointing out.
Okay. Thank you very much for talking to us, Dr. Nageshwaran. Stay safe and stay healthy.
You too. Thank you very much.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.